So the rubric for this this project is on Moodle already. If you look in Moodle under week 1, where I was showing you just a second ago, the assignment, it says 2 here, but I meant 1. I'll change that. So it says assignment 1, description of continuous assessment. That should be 1 instead of 2. But click on that and you'll see what I'm about to show you, plus more. Wrong one. Okay, so the continuous education or continuous assessment starts off like this. I'm just going to scroll through it real quick. Some of the reviews, the university policy, so you have no excuse to commit plagiarism or anything like that. It gives again the topics, and then it talks about the evaluation breakdown, and then there's a rubric under this. But basically, the first thing is to describe the issues involved. So that's the main thing, help us understand the kind of the pros and cons. Then you have structure and language and vocal delivery and physical delivery. Let me go down to the rubric itself. To get an A, for example, let me just read it. Shows excellent understanding of topic. All ideas are extremely relevant to the topic, fulfills all its requirements. Content demonstrates that the student is very knowledgeable, matured, and independent in thinking. Use of significant research, of news articles in relation to the topic. Use of relevant examples of quotes and news reports in illustrating the key issues. Someplace in there it says, oh, right here, it says 3 sample of news reports, 3 quotes. So those are, you're supposed to be analyzing the news reports and show some quotes that maybe illustrate your point. Like if you think it's biased reporting or something, you can pull out a quote and use that to demonstrate that. Under structure, it says have a good introduction. Oh, clear, I guess it should just dash there. Clear and coherent, establishing clearly the context for the audience. Main body is extremely interesting. Description. Now you're not actually writing this, but still they're expecting you, obviously, in your presentation. You give a strong introduction. You then you go on to the details. So it sounds like it's an article almost, but in a sense, that's you form a presentation in the same way that you create a good article. So their citations, quotations are done correctly, accurately, and consistently. It says using Harvard referencing style or APA. Main points. I don't know, maybe when they first made this, they actually did have it. It sounds so much like they expect a written report, but we don't. Main supporting points are organized very logically and has cohesion, coherence, conclusion. In the conclusion, you have a clear ending of the outline with satisfying resolution. Format is excellent with clear, distinctive paragraphs neatly and professionally typed. Going back to the referencing, it would still be maybe at the bottom of your slides. You could put the actual reference so we can see where you got the information. And so that could be an APA style, for example, so that we know where you found the information. Language, near native mastery, and this is all for an A, and you can guess that it diminishes from there what our expectations are. Near native mastery of the language, excellent mastery of grammar, spelling, and punctuation, accurate, appropriate, and broad range of vocabulary and sentence structures, hardly any mistakes. Overall vocal delivery, tremendous clarity in voice, with no verbal errors, clear articulation of spoken words, high volume, and measured rate of speech, uses pauses to good effect, and has a compelling verbal delivery with excellent preparation. And then the physical delivery, sustained eye contact and positive engagement with audience, confident body language with effective use of gestures, leaves a powerful impression overall, impactful presentation of visual aid if used. you should have some visual aids. I won't even say if used. I don't see how you, it may not be PowerPoint, it may be some other visual aid, but you certainly would have some visual aid. So I don't think it's possible to get an A without visual aids. Let me put it that way. I can't imagine it. It might be different than we're used to. You might do video, you might do something else, but something, you're not just going to stand there, I don't think. Okay, so that's the rubric. Any questions on that? So, you know, I think when we're looking at content, we want you to be looking at the content of the news reports. So this delineates, have basically slides. I don't know how you do it without slides to really do it well. We want to see that you have some good quotes that you can pull out of your sources, some samples of news reports, and so forth. Show that you that your explanation, your content has covered the 5 W's and H, and so forth. So that's the rubric. It is on Moodle already, so you can take a look at that. Yeah. When I was a kid growing up on the farm, we used to go rattlesnake hunting, and I don't know if you remember the rattlesnakes. They're poisonous, and they have a rattle in their tail, and their tail is something like shh. I can't hear them. We killed 80 rattlesnakes one year hunting. My dad can't hear them either. So our ears don't hear certain frequencies. So especially when you're trying to whisper to me, that's kind of like a shh rattlesnake. So when you're whispering, that's not a good idea with me. Speak up, and so I can hear. As long if you're expressing yourself strongly, I can probably understand. I can probably hear it okay. But like I say, the whisper, I can't hear whispers. That's too much like a rattlesnake. Too much like too much of that frequency, whatever frequency it is, I can't hear. I can't hear it. Okay, so any other questions? Oh, anyway, the question was, can you cover something sensitive? In other words, something that somebody might object to, somebody that might disagree with. And the answer is yes, you can. But what is the point of this? We want both sides, though. So if you have two sides of an issue, you can cover the one you think is sensitive that somebody might be upset about, and you should cover the other side that they're not going to be upset about. So as far as I'm concerned, that's what journalism is all about. So that is actually, how can you cover the 5 W's if you don't cover the sensitive part? So you risk not getting a good grade if you don't cover something that you think is sensitive. If you don't have a team, by the way, there are going to be some people with only 2 people, and you just add yourself to somebody that has 2 people. And not very many people are signed up yet. So, but there's a team already with only 2 people, with only 1 person on it, and so apparently doesn't have a team yet. So you can just add your name to somebody else's team if you don't have a team yet. Okay, let me go on to another rubric. The same one here. Participation. You may recall, and we mentioned it yesterday, one of the 10% of the grade is participation. So there is a rubric for participation also. And it's rather detailed, so I'm not going to try to go over it all. But you see some of the subjects over here on the left. You may have a hard time. Let me blow it up a little bit if I can. And I'll just go down the left side if I can do that. Okay, so quality of work. That's, well, I could disagree with some of these, and you might disagree with them, but this is the rubric that I inherited, and so this is the rubric. Actually, I think, I'm not sure how much input I'll actually have on this. The lead instructor is actually Gazilla, and she's going to do, so she's may do it all by herself. I'm not sure. So if she asks me for my input, I will obviously give some. Timeliness of work, task support, consider the amount of task support the student team member gives to the other team members. Interaction, consider how this team member relates and communicates to other team members. I would say it's more than just team members because we only have the one team project. So some of this refers to teams, but obviously it's, we'll look at it beyond teams. How much do you participate in class, obviously. Your attendance is obviously important. Do you seem to be taking a leadership role in the class, something like that in the class and in your team as we observe it? As you do your presentation, or do you stand out in your presentation as a leader in your presentation, so forth? Anyway, it may be, I find it a little bit unclear still myself, but you kind of get the idea. I've had a hard time figuring out how to grade participation, and so I typically just say participation kind of shows up in your attendance. If you're coming to all the classes, you get all the points. But this is a matrix rubric that somebody else has provided for the class in the past. And like I said, I may not be the one grading it, so be prepared to, be familiar with it and be as active as you can in class. And that's, what can I say? There it is. So that's also on Moodle. So you can take a look at that more closely and read all the detail of it if you want to. Okay, let me go back and then just go ahead and go through the overall syllabus. We kind of jumped ahead of that just a little bit, but I wanted you to particularly start thinking about the teams, and so that we can start filling that up. I mentioned the other day with the teams, before I go on again, that if you choose one of the first ones, actually, I guess I should say, the first one on the list will be the first one to present. If nobody signs up for subjects 1 and 2, that means right now there are people that signed up for 3. You'll be the first one presenting. So just because we don't have 26 weeks, I can't associate the number with the week because we don't have 26 weeks. So once we start getting that filled out, okay, I'll give you a few minutes to do that.
According to the order of the topics, right?
Do we know it?
Our presentation order is according to the.
If somebody else assigned, yeah, well, in the order of, so like I said, if nobody signs up for topic 1, then we'll go ahead to the next one that is signed up for, because there's 26 subjects and we only have, we're going to be presenting over a period of time of like 12 weeks. So we will go in order though, yeah. Unless you negotiate with somebody else. If you negotiate with another team, you can trade if they are willing to trade. Otherwise, I presume that we'll go in the order.
So if I change my order, I should tell
you. Yeah, I guess so. I mean, obviously, you'll tell me when whoever is presenting that day should tell us who's presenting. But so I don't care too much to know in advance as long as, if you've organized with somebody else, you've switched with somebody else, then I do eventually need to know that. So yeah, you could advise me and then I will know a little better. Yeah.
Is it okay to do it on my own?
You want
to do it on my own?
Yeah, well, if you want to do that, that's fine. You should, I guess, scratch out or just scribble in the other blanks.
I already wrote my name.
Yeah.
Someone can join me.
Well, yeah. Well, I mean, unless you scribble on those other blanks,
yeah, okay.
Then somebody else could sign in there.
Okay.
Okay, the main thing I want to cover in this, I think, is just to remind you where your grade's coming from. We already covered a couple of rubrics here. So participation, we just looked at that rubric, a little bit unclear. It's problematic to have a participation grade, I think. So when I do it, but when I have a class by myself, I don't use a rubric like that. Mine is pretty much based on showing up. But I have tried some other things before. Under participation, I used to just call on people and see if they could answer my question, just randomly. And if they couldn't answer my question, then they got a deduction for not being able to answer my question, if it's something they should have known. So, but anyway, so participation is 10%. Assignment 1 is 10%. So 1 is the presentation. That's a team project. The assignment 2 is the written project we talked about. That's 20%. Assignment 3 is the video project. That's 20%. And then 40% is the final exam. Let me say 2 things about the final exam. First off, I think I kind of suggested this the other day, but let me reiterate it. The university, and maybe it's the Ministry of Education, I'm putting pressure on them, but we can only give 20% A and A minuses in the class. If I go in, they might let me get in with 21% or 22%, maybe even up to 25%. But somewhere in there, they're going to say, you need to go change your final exam grades somehow. So because they say that to us now, the final exam cannot be all multiple choice. They've told me that before when my final exam was all multiple choice, and then how the heck do you change grades in a multiple choice test? That makes no sense at all. That's crazy. So consequently, final exams nowadays, for a couple of reasons, but that's one of the main reasons, have to have some essays and so forth, because we have to be able to grade. Honestly, what I do is when I get all my grades the way I think they should be, if I have too many A's, I just add I start deducting a certain number of points from everybody and see what happens next. And so if I have just a little bit too many, then I might deduct 2 points from everybody, because I have to do what the administration tells me to do if I want to work here. And so I just arbitrarily give everybody a 2-point deduction until I get down to my 20 to 25% A minus and A's. That's the only fair way I can figure out to do it. Because I don't think that's particularly fair, because if you earned an A, you should get an A. But that's not what the university says. They say only so many of you can have an A. We have to grade in the curve somehow, and somehow when we hand in those final scores, and it's not just the final exam, but all your overall grade, somewhere between 20 and 25% of you can get an A or A minus. However, we have to rig the system. That's what they're telling us. I don't like that. In America, I could give everybody an A, and that's my complaint. All their academic freedom, and that means the professor, and then you almost can't fire them, and they can do just about anything they want to. So it's anyway, it's a different system. So, but consequently, because of that, we're almost forced into, like I say, having a final exam that has quite a few open-ended questions that we can grade somewhat. We still have to have a rubric for it, but somehow we have to screw with the system to come up with the number of A's finally in the course. I hate that. I hope you understand that. I think that's ridiculous, but that's the way it is. And I'm not saying, as I said, I'm not sure exactly where I'm thinking it's coming primarily from the Ministry of Education. So I don't think it's just our administrators doing this. It's coming down, and we have to get accreditation in order to function here. And so one of the things that this Ministry of Education believes very strongly is that that there should be a separation in grades that shows who's good at it and who's bad at it. One thing I will resist is that it suggests some of you should flunk. And unless you quit coming to class, nobody's going to flunk. I can pretty much guarantee you that. If you just don't do anything, you can flunk. That you're going to have to be really inactive to flunk this class. So that's part of the bell curve I'm not going to cooperate with. You'd have to, again, give me a very good reason to do that. And I don't usually give a lot of D's, although they want us to have an average. Another one of the rules, to have an average of B minus. So I don't like that either. Anyway, so I just want you to understand how the system that we're all working under. And so, yeah, I think if I'm a good teacher, then you should all be able to get an A because I teach you so well. That's my philosophy. So, but that's not the situation. Okay, so any questions on these before we go on? We've covered this yesterday quite a bit, but I just wanted to cover, answer a few more questions and let you know what the facts of life are here. And so that's what you can expect with the final exam. You can expect quite a few open-ended questions, so we can, because how do you adjust grades on a final exam if it's multiple choice? That's crazy. You can't do it. So it pretty much forces you to have have essays and so forth in a final exam. So you can decide who had the best essay and who had the worst essay and grade accordingly. Okay. Yeah. Okay, I want to go to project 2 then and start talking about that a little bit. There is I don't really use a rubric. I might try to come up with a rubric, but in something that's artistic, how the heck do you make a rubric in something that's artistic? Because if there's any artistic element to it, then my opinion is going to be different than the opinion of every other. It was kind of like in the scientific method, you should be able to duplicate the study and come up with this more or less the same results. And so a rubric suggests that you can do that. If the product is artistic, then I would say probably you'd get a different grade from me than you would get from another professor. It's not going to be scientific. It suggests that it is, but it can't be if there's an artistic element to it. So I want to teach you how I see news writing. And so you can try to see it. I told you the other day, try to out-psych me. I wanted to give you all the psychological things about me that you need to know to try to out-psych me and come up with a product that I like. And so my critique sheet is not a rubric, but it tells you what you need to do to get an A. This is also on Moodle. So I'll take some time going through this. I expect no fewer than 600 words. I would say 1,000 would be the most on this story. 1,000 words is not really too much if you have lots of quotes. I told you the other day, I like quotes. I think quotes humanize a story. They help us to kind of have a feel for your sources, how they think, how they speak. They share their feelings. It's not just statistics, but they're sharing their feelings, not just facts. And so I like direct quotes. So with direct quotes, if you conduct 2 interviews, 1,000 words is not very much, because direct quotes can take a lot of space. Now, obviously, if you just start using direct quotes, you have a tape recorder and you just transcribe it and you plop that thing in the story, that's not a good story. And so I'm going to show you some ways to deal with that. Let me blow this up a little bit if I can. Okay, one of the first things I'm looking for is a strong lead. In some of my classes, I make a lead. A lead, by the way, is just the first paragraph. By my definition, taken from a textbook many years ago, there's two types. There's the lead, and there's what this other author called the complete lead. He created this differentiation because first off, the idea of a lead is that you include a summary of the story. That's kind of the idea, particularly more in the old days than now, but still quite normally, you're summarizing the story so that the reader can see, do I want to read the rest of the story? And so it may not be a direct summary, but at least hints, at least gives us some idea what this story is about, typically. Not always, but typically. And so that lead is important. But if it's truly summarizing, can you really summarize all 5 W's and an H and keep your lead short? Because we found over the years that short leads are better read, they're more frequently read than long leads. And so some newspapers that don't use this approach of having the complete lead, a complete lead is typically at least 2 paragraphs. And so the idea is that you have 2 paragraphs, or even more if you need them, to summarize the story. And so you can now, and the idea of this then is that the lead would not be longer than 35 words maximum. And I don't mind 25 words, even 15-word leads. But then how do you summarize? You summarize with paragraph 2. And so the idea of the lead and complete lead solves a problem that too many of the leads in news writing were too long, because they were trying to summarize the whole story, and you can't do it in 35 words basically, and certainly not less than that. So you'll see that I refer to that I want a lead that the lead is 15 to 35 words, but then paragraph 2 is paragraph 1 and 2 together is a complete lead. Paragraph 1 and 2, and maybe even 3. In fact, I remember in the textbook that I took this idea from, he had an example, and I put one in my textbook as well. I put some chapters from my textbook also on Moodle. I have an example, as he had an example, of a really long lead, 8 paragraphs or 9 paragraphs or 10 paragraphs. Now that's unusual, but the point was, in putting a really long complete lead, is that we're not going to limit the complete lead. Now, the only time you're going to have an 8-paragraph complete lead is if you're doing a descriptive lead, probably. In other words, you're trying to, I think my example in this is an example of nuclear terrorism. And I start off with kind of painting a picture of a pretty spring day or whatever, and then suddenly the mushroom cloud. And so I'm kind of drawing you into the story with a descriptive lead. Another possibility is a narrative lead, descriptive narrative lead, kind of very similar. And then the boom. So that's, I think mine is even more than 8 paragraphs. So it's possible to have a complete lead that's more than 2 paragraphs. But typically you can summarize a story in 2 paragraphs, and then so that's what I'm looking for here under number 1, 20%. I think I started to say, I don't think I finished it, was I have some classes where I say the lead is worth 50%. The lead is very, very, very important. And so if I'm teaching a beginning class, I might put the lead as worth half of the grade for some assignments, because I want to see if they know how to find what I call the whammy, the hook, some people call it. How do you get people's attention? So as you go through your notes, and this will be part of your challenge, if you're doing 2 interviews, how do you find in those 2 interviews your whammy, your hook? How do you find what's going to get people's attention? Because that's part of your lead. The point of the lead is to get people's attention and draw them into the story. If you don't accomplish that, then bam, you're going to get a bunch of these points off. You need to get people's attention, and at the same time, by the end of paragraph 2 or so, give somewhat of a summary of what you're talking about here. Not all stories are written in inverted pyramid, and this is more or less, when I go through this, I'm talking about an inverted pyramid organization. Some feature stories would not be an inverted pyramid. What is inverted pyramid? What's the nature of an inverted pyramid story? Do we know what we're talking about when we're talking about inverted pyramids? So what's in the first paragraph, the first few paragraphs? The least important information? No, it's the most important information. Have they explained to you how it started, the inverted pyramid? Anybody knows how it began? The inverted pyramid began during the Civil War in America. A lot of the tactics and the rules that we use for journalism came from America, because we had a free press, and then it existed in a competitive marketplace. And so, the ones that were most interesting survived, and the newspapers that were most interesting survived, and those that were less interesting died. The stories that were most interesting went on the front page, and and people who didn't write interesting stories got fired. I mean, in a competitive marketplace, it develops better and better products. Anyway, during the Civil War in the 1800s, in the 1860 era, where the North and the South fought primarily over the issue of slavery, but there were other issues as well. All the fighting was inside our country, and in some cases, as the battle lines would drift, the armies would have a different motivation to cut off communication. So communication in those days, the rapid communication, was telegraph, and they were using Morse code, whatever, to Morse code their stories. So the journalists were also doing this. They would go to the telegraph office, and they would give the telegraph operator their story, and he would start, or they might just cite it to him, just do it ad lib, so to speak. But they'd tell him their story, and the telegraph operator would use Morse code to send it to their newspaper in Philadelphia or New York or wherever they were from. Well, as I said, the battle lines were always shifting, and so every so often somebody would say, we need to blow up the telegraph lines. And so, boom, now the reporters had no way to get their story in, and frequently that happened right in the middle of their story. And so here they're sending their story, and boom, they can't send the rest of it. So what their editors tell them: send us the most important stuff first. we can't afford to have half a story and have the boring stuff sent to us first. So in those days, they probably did a lot like you guys do with a lot of your classes. You try to build to the most interesting at the end of your essay or whatever. And you can't do that in journalism, or they couldn't do it then, and we don't do it very often in journalism today. We give the most important stuff, most interesting stuff first, in case the telegraph line blows up. Or now we found out after that people like stories better that way. They like to know the best stuff first, the most interesting stuff first. And so when journalism is written that way, they can very quickly, and if headlines also help, they can decide very quickly whether they want to read a story. Not every story is written for everybody. Some stories are, have, just certain people are interested in it. And that's probably most stories. There's relatively few that everybody reads. So we want to help them out. When I teach editing, I emphasize headlines and leads in there also, because the editors have to make sure that headlines and leads tell the reader why they should read the story. And if they don't like it, then they go on to another story. So we're trying to do them a service. Anyway, in here, let me blow this up even a little bit more. Some of you in the back may have trouble seeing it. Okay, so that's basically what that's explaining, short. It makes reference to the excerpt from my textbook that's on Moodle. So you can go right to those pages. I think those pages are still accurate. I don't know. I've monkeyed with it a little bit and had to type it back in again. And anyway, so there you might even find some typos in it from when somebody typed it back into a computer. So basic 5 W's is the second part of the question. And again, that then relates to the complete lead. Has it been summarized within the first couple 3 paragraphs? Whatever you need, usually just 2 paragraphs. Considering paragraph 1 and paragraph 2, so the example here is a complete lead. So marketing and PR in the 21st century are undergoing dramatic changes, says David W. Guth, an American public relations expert visiting Malaysia. Paragraph 2 gives more of the 5 W's. Guth was the keynote speaker at the conference, The Decline of Mass Marketing, the Rise of Consumer-Focused Marketing at Xiamen University, Malaysia on June 15th. Speakers at the conference also explained how mobile technology is quickly providing broadband internet access to the most remote villages around the globe, which is having a major impact on PR marketing as well as on world cultures. So as you go through the story, you would find that this basically summarizes the most important parts of a story, of that particular story. Item 2, 20% also for this class is attribution. I was talking a second ago about, you do your survey, you do your interviews, and now you have this interview and you have that interview. Now, how do you put them together? And so this kind of relates to that, partly to that anyway, and that first off, have you attributed essentially everything? That's the first rule of this, or not the first rule, actually the first rule I put here is you need multiple sources. So you need at least 2 sources. But the second one that used to be the first one is essentially every paragraph should have attribution. So attribution is who said it, or if it came from a documented source, where did it come from? In some cases, if you're quoting the same person repeatedly, of course, you do go back and forth between, Harvey said and he said and Harvey said and whatever. But it might be possible that you can leave a paragraph without attribution. But that's only if there's absolutely no question where this information came from. And so I very rarely have a paragraph without attribution. In this case, I think paragraph 2 was without attribution because that was, I could say, according to organizers or something. But that's frequently when you're kind of summarizing where this occurred or whatever, people let you pass on having an attribution for that sort of a paragraph. Also, one of the essentials of attribution that I just want to make sure beginning journalists understand is that by Associated Press style, which is pretty much universal, the first reference you put the title and complete name. A lot of newspapers change this, but I'm going to go ahead and have you do AP style in this class. Second reference, AP is Associated Press. Those that are not familiar with that, Associated Press, almost everybody, there's very few newspapers in America. There's like 10,000 newspapers, a little less than 2,000 daily newspapers, and almost all of them use Associated Press style books. There are AP style books in our library, and it's not just used in America, but used in many parts of the world. Some newspapers do their own style book. New York Times had its own style book, but if you actually look at it, you find out that they pretty much copied AP style, and they made a few changes. The daily newspaper I worked for used AP style, but then they had a sheet of where they disagreed with it. So it was a small community, and they decided that in second reference you would use the courtesy title, Mr., Mrs., Ms. So the newspaper I worked for, the daily paper I worked for, used the courtesy titles on second reference or after the first reference. My newspapers, the ones that I controlled, I went with AP style. So they make a few changes sometimes, but most of them go by Associated Press style. And for this class, that's what I'm using. So second, after you get past the first reference where you get the full name and title, then you just go to the last name. That is the family name. Yeah, we're used to saying it last name. I understand your family name isn't the last name in Chinese or whatever. But anyway, and in Russian and a lot of languages don't put the family name last. So excuse me when I say that. The family name ends up being the name that you use in the attribution. If you happen to have 2 people with the same family name, then you need to start. There are ways to handle that, but then you start having to use their first names along with that. Or if they're different sex, if that's like a husband and wife thing, then you go to the courtesy title in order to make sure you're not using the family name only with 2 people with the same family name. You can't do that. So there's some rules in the AP style book of how to handle that sort of situation. Item 3 here is use direct quotes. A lot of them. I try to, I would say in my stories, typically it's about 40% direct quote. And I think that's good for this class, even if the other professors disagree. For this class, being an interview class, I think that's a good number for sure. So you're using actual direct quotes from the interviews that you do. Now, I do it anyway, like I say, with almost every story, not every story, but I would say typically I'm averaging around 40% direct quote for the reasons I said before. It gives credibility and it gives personality. That if I'm just writing the whole thing myself with indirect quotes, you understand the difference between direct quotes and indirect quotes? Direct quotes are going to have quote marks around it. Indirect quotes still attributed to the same source, but no quote marks. So you're saying this is essentially what he said with an indirect quote. A direct quote has quote marks. You're saying this is almost exactly what he said. And I'll talk a little more about that later. Because most direct quotes are not exactly right. And I'll explain why that's a good thing in some cases, a bad thing in other cases. Anyway, so I want somewhere around 40% direct quotes. That's my style, and it's good for this class, being an interview class anyway. And then so you then interweave, item D there, you interweave your direct quotes, and their indirect quotes can come in the form of paraphrase. Sometimes you call it indirect quotes. A paraphrase is a little bit more of a summary of an indirect quote. So it's a little bit shorter, but they're essentially the same. A paraphrase, if it's attributed, is still an indirect quote. It's just shorter. So you may see me call it an indirect quote. You may see me refer to it as a paraphrase. For all intents and purposes, it's the same. I kind of weave them back and forth because the paraphrase allows me to direct the story with my words. So it's his ideas, my words, in directing the story. And I'll show you how that works in a few minutes. But so I kind of interweave the two. I don't usually have too many consecutive paragraphs of direct quote. Very, very seldom. Some stories, perhaps, but most stories, no. And then be specific about what was said. We don't want to use what I call an about paragraph. In other words, you're saying what they spoke about is boring. Very rarely do you say what they spoke about. You instead say what they said. It may be a paraphrase, but you're still saying, such as the lead I gave you is, in essence, this is basically a paraphrase. Okay, the lead here is a paraphrase. It's an indirect quote, paraphrase. And so I'm saying, marketing and PR in the 21st century are undergoing dramatic changes, says David W. Guth. So I'm saying what he said, but I'm saying in my words, more or less, his ideas, my words. And I'm trying to say it in a very short, powerful way in the lead to get your attention if you're interested in marketing. And but with the attribution in there and giving some of the other five W's in the lead and then the rest in paragraph 2. So that sort of thing allows me, even within the story, the indirect quotes and the paraphrases allow me to weave the story in a way that it flows smoothly. You can't just stack a whole bunch of direct quotes together and make it sound smooth. It's not right, and you'll get graded down for that by any professor. Okay, so that's the areas that I cover under attribution, using direct quotes, but interweaving with indirect quotes or paraphrases. Language, even though I use a lot of direct quotes, that's not the same as being wordy. Wordy is using a lot of words to say what you can say shorter. Direct quotes, that may be true in a sense, but direct quotes should be pared down. You should edit them down well enough that it's not boring. That what they're saying, the way they say it, the way they articulate it, the emotion they add to it or whatever, still makes that direct quote interesting. If you're really, some newspapers have such tight space, they use almost no direct quotes. I think they get kind of boring. Again, they don't have that personality and they don't have the credibility if they don't have direct quotes. So anyway, don't be wordy, but so we want to be as simple as possible. Simple words, simple phrases, simple sentences, simple paragraphs. Keep everything as simple as possible. I teach, I haven't done it here, but in Kazakhstan where I taught before, they had me teach professors how to write more simply. Because what I found, especially it's a problem with those to whom English is not their first language, is they try to use words that they don't really fully understand. And when they start using words that they don't fully control and understand, then it sounds awkward and they get clobbered, whether it's by a teacher or by a journal that they're submitting an article to. They get clobbered. Especially if English is not your first language, but even if it is, what I'm teaching the professors is, what did I learn from my very first article I talked about in the last class? I learned that I could be published with a simple story. And so I wrote it like a journalist, and it wasn't just published, it was made the lead article in one of the top journals. And so that has guided my research writing ever since, is I believe in simple writing, even if you're writing about difficult academic subjects. If you're writing about nuclear fusion, you should write about it simply and clearly. You can write about anything at an 8th grade level. You may have to actually use more words ultimately in trying to explain it and so forth, because you're talking to an 8th grader. I use that term because that is what we aim at in American journalism. We try to write to an 8th grader. And there's two advantages to that. First off, we don't know who's reading it. And so it may be an 8th grader or somebody with an 8th grade reading level. So we want to make sure in mass media that everybody can read it and understand it. But even what did I find with my journal article? What I found was even people with a PhD like simple writing. They like it because people with a PhD are busy and they want to be able to skim it and understand it very quickly. They don't want to have to read a paragraph 3 times to understand it. That will make them very upset. And so what I found, and even in academic writing, that PhDs prefer simple writing. And that's basically what I taught the professors at Keeping Up University, where I was at before. Keep it simple, even in academic writing. So certainly in journalistic writing, we want to keep it simple. Don't try to sound smart. And that's basically what I tell the professors. Don't sound smart. Sound accurate. Tell us, have the information show us that you're smart. Have the details show us that you're smart. Don't try to make yourself sound smart with big words, complicated sentences, long paragraphs. That's the wrong way to prove that you're smart, especially in journalism. That's the wrong way. The right way is to keep it simple, cover it well, make sure you did a good interview, make sure you have good information, make it interesting, put the most interesting stuff at first, learn how to emphasize interesting stuff within the story at the same time. Use simple words, simple sentences. If you have a sentence that is what we call a compound sentence. What's a compound sentence? Do you want to define what a compound sentence is? Should I be taking notes for your participation? Do you have an idea?
Combined sentence which is composed of noun, subject, noun, verb, and subject.
Actually, that can be a simple sentence. But a compound sentence will end up with 2 verbs, and usually 2 objects. And actually, with a compound sentence, it'll have 2 subjects. So you're going to have a comma or a semicolon in the middle of it, because you're hooking 2 sentences together in essence. And you could put a period there. But for some reason you think, well, if you're going to use a compound sentence, you're thinking the story flows better if that it's kind of choppy if you split it up. It's kind of a very, very associated ideas. So you're going to make this one a little bit longer. But as a journalist, as an editor, I'm going to look at every compound sentence and decide as an editor whether you're justified in not putting a period there, because I want simple sentences. And it's more skimmable with simple sentences and so forth. But you will see that I use compound sentences sometimes. But as an editor, I'm looking for that all the time. And to you, I'm your editor. Okay? That's how you need to think of me. I'm your editor. And I want you to keep simple sentences, sometimes compound sentences. But you need to, like I say, every time you use a compound sentence, as you edit your own material, ask yourself whether it's justified, whether it really sounds better as a compound sentence, or the danger is that it sounds confusing. Every confusing sentence is either a compound sentence, almost by definition, or you've screwed up things like your pronoun, what the antecedents of your pronouns and stuff. In other words, you use he and you don't know which he, because the sentence talks about two guys. So, there's something, either you're screwing up the antecedents or you have a compound sentence, or both, and very frequently both. So if ever I'm reading a story as an editor, and that includes my own stories, I self-edit a lot of stuff. When I'm reading a story and I find myself asking, or just having to think, if I have to stop and think at all, there's something wrong. So if I find I have to stop, then I analyze that sentence very carefully. What's wrong here? Is it an antecedent? Am I confusing myself, or is the writer confusing me by the pronouns and I don't know who it's referring to? Is it just too long of a sentence? Do I need to cut it down? Why am I stopping here and asking myself what this writer means, even if it's me? If I'm editing myself, I usually try to leave a couple of days before I go back and edit it, so I can actually I say I'm reading it with new eyes, because I forgot exactly what I was trying to say, and so I go back and I kind of stop saying what did I mean by that, and then I can catch my own problems. Okay, so flow. So make sure that your story flows smoothly from point to point. Sometimes you need to use formal transition devices to change topics, sources, etc. But just make sure it's smooth. Double check your basic English, obviously. Remember the rules of writing quotes. Okay, here's an important one, because this is an interviewing class. So you have, and I told you I want somewhere around 40% direct quotes. So how do you use the direct quotes? So here's some examples. Again, I borrowed this from another textbook, Type 1, Type 2, and Type 3 quotes. Type 1, example here, Harvey said, one of the strongest trends in online marketing is native advertising. The type refers to where is the attribution. So type 1, the attribution is at the start. Harvey said, okay, I'm the attribution. Broadcasting uses a lot more type 1. Because, how do I say this? One of the rules here is that type 1 is almost always, even in print journalism, an indirect quote or paraphrase. Why would it be? Why would I want to put type 1 with an indirect quote? It's the same reason why it's used in broadcasting. The reason is that if you start saying what they said before they get to who said it, it's confusing. And so even in text, if I have a long indirect quote before I get to who said it, the reader's starting to think, why is this writer giving this dialogue, giving this monologue here in the middle of this story? Because you haven't told them who said it. So it's not you, it's your source, but the source is too far down the paragraph. So when you don't have quote marks to tell them this is a direct quote, then you want to put the attribution at the beginning. And since in broadcast you don't say, you don't have direct quotes on anything unless it's in video. And so in broadcasting, most of your attribution is type 1. So understand there's a difference between broadcasting. This is one of the main differences between broadcast writing and newspaper writing, is where do you put the attribution. And it's all about the fact that you can tell the reader very quickly whether or not it's a direct quote by quote marks in print. And you don't have those except with video or audio, I guess. If you have just the audio, then you can tell somebody else's voice is saying it. So type 1, you put the attribution at the beginning, and that's usually an indirect quote. Type 2 and 3 are typically direct quotes. Type 2, the attribution's at the end of the quote. So in this case, the example is native advertising is created to blend in with organic content, such as the sponsored postings appearing within a Facebook timeline, Harvey said. Again, if that were an indirect quote, you'd be confused at who's saying this until it got to the end, but it has quote marks, so your reader understands this is somebody saying this. And a type 3, the attribution in the middle. It doesn't matter whether it's one sentence or 2 sentences or possibly 3 sentences. It's in the middle of that quote that you have in one place, in one paragraph. So the first example of type 3 is in the middle of a compound sentence. We were just talking about compound sentences. This is one of them. So you pay for native advertising, end quote, Harvey said, but it blends in with unpaid content, including some of your own. Okay, this is a short enough, when we're talking about compound sentences, this one all flows together. It's still relatively short compound sentence, and in this case, it's divided by the attribution anyway. So this, I think, is a good use of a compound sentence, but again, be careful of them. But it's also a type 3 down at the bottom. Where is it at? Well, okay, yeah. So type 3 down at the bottom is 2 separate sentences. It's still considered type 3. It's in one paragraph. And so it's native advertising is one reason why on the internet a company would be crazy not to practice integrated marketing communications, -IMC, Harvey said. New sentence. The same team should be preparing free social media postings as it should have it in there, as it prepares the paid native advertising, since they may be exactly the same. Okay, so that's what I was trying to demonstrate there is that's still type 3 with the attribution splitting up 2 totally separate sentences. Any questions as I go along? Feel free to interrupt me. Okay, so part of that language is how to handle your attribution, how to handle your direct quotes, because that's very important. If you don't handle it this way, then you're going to run into some problems. Again, if you use a long direct quote and put the attribution at the end, you'll get deducted for that, points deducted from that because it confuses the reader. And yet, on the other hand, why do we use type 2 and type 3 in print? Why do we ever use type 2 and type 3 in print? What do you think? What would be the logic behind using type 2 and type 3? That is the attribution at the end, type 2, or the attribution in the middle, type 3. Why would we ever use it in print? It's more interesting, right? We want the most interesting thing in the lead. Well, in a paragraph within the story also, we want to get interesting stuff to the start of the sentence, start of the paragraph. And what somebody says should be more interesting than who said it. It isn't always, but it usually is. And so type 2 and type 3 puts the priority in what was said rather than who said it. We have to use type 1 sometimes because we need to let people know because it's not a direct quote. Once in a while, we have to use type 1 with a direct quote because we just changed sources. If we change sources, we have we're with one speaker and then we go to a new speaker, even if it's a direct quote, like for example, surveys, what we call maybe a man in the street survey. You do a story, you go out and talk to 10 students about the university grading system. Well, you have 10 people and they might have really short quotes that you're collecting from them. And so the idea of doing a paraphrase to kind of summarize what somebody said and then their direct quote gets a little bit wordy. It does get wordy then. And so you're going, since they're all talking about the same subject, you kind of introduce all these people, and you don't want to have, like say, you don't want to have the burden of putting an indirect quote between every person because they're all talking about the same subject. And so you end up changing sources with direct quotes. You do want the direct quotes because you want to be accurate, and it's man on the street style interviewing. So you have a type 1 direct quote. To just break it up, make sure they understand, you just change your source. But that's usually that sort of a situation, like where you have you're quoting a survey with lots of open-ended questions, or you're doing man on the street. You just have lots of sources for some reason. Then you're going to ask some type 1 direct quotes. But typically the strategy is get the interesting stuff to the start, and that's usually what they said, not who said it. So type 2 and type 3 do that. So that's what I expect to see in your writing. Very, very verb tenses strategically. So in a lot of my writing, I mentioned that I was competing against daily newspapers in a lot of cases. And so I was doing issue-oriented stories. And sometimes my interviews might have been several days old. So here I am competing with a daily paper who puts out a story the very next day after they interview people, or after they've attended a meeting or whatever. So in order for me not to sound outdated, especially if it's an issue-oriented story, I don't tell people when people said something. I might have even got a quote from a couple of weeks ago. Most magazines have deadlines of like 3 months before they go to press. And so if you look at magazines, most magazines do not tell you the when of an interview. They avoid telling you the when because they don't want to tell you it was 3 months ago or 4 months ago or 6 months ago, heaven forbid. They don't want to tell you that because one of the news values is timeliness. And so if they tell you they did this interview 6 months ago, you're going to say, this is old stuff. A lot could change in 6 months. So, and that was especially true for me fighting against a daily newspaper. So I made mine timeless. I eliminated as many dates as possible, and I used, the point I'm saying here is I used present tense verbs. So this is where I would say, the councilman says, not that he said. Because if I said, I'd have to kind of say when he said it. There's a feeling as you read a past tense verb and you introduce a new person and he said something, there's a sense in a news story that you have to say when he said it. And so by using present tense, you just avoid saying the when. You're covering an issue. Even though some of the quotes might have come from a meeting, that's not the point. You weren't covering the meeting. You're covering the issue that was discussed in the meeting. And you did some interviews after the meeting. And so the meeting is almost, you might say something about the meeting. You might mention that this was brought up at the city council meeting, but that's not, you're not reporting on the meeting, you're reporting on the issue. So other than just mentioning that it was talked about at that meeting, you can still go with present tense verbs. So you can do that with interview stories very easily, because based story doesn't have a meeting, doesn't have a specific date that's critical. And in fact, your story, when we got together to talk about the student newspaper, we wanted some stories that could be held even until next February, because we have a short semester and we will put out 24 pages in each edition, each of three editions in the year. So we need some stories written, maybe not this semester, but at least by fall semester. We need some stories written that we can hold until February. That's what you would do with that sort of a story. A feature story, an issue-oriented story, you would leave the time element off, and it would show up. You might do the interviews in October. The story isn't printed in the student newspaper until February or March or whenever. Because the date wasn't important, it was the issue that was important. So it was an event, it was not an event, it was an issue. So use them strategically. The other thing is be careful of using a lot of variety in the verbs that you use for attribution. Many newspaper editors in America say don't use anything else. It's said, or says, no other verb. Not stated, not claimed, not questioned, not anything else. And students automatically say, that's boring. And the answer is, actually, if you will honestly read an American newspaper and not be too cognizant of the attribution, when you're all done, you will not have noticed that every attribution was said. So actually, when you don't use said or says, when you don't use that same verb over and over again, these other verbs draw attention to attribution. They're the ones that draw attention to it. If you use said with every word, if that's your only word of attribution you use, then a reader who's not thinking about this, who's not told to think about it, they don't think about it. They just go on from quote to quote and so forth. They don't think about whether you said or claimed or whatever, unless you start using other words. Once you start saying claimed, and if you do use the other ones, there's also the other problem. Not only do they draw attention to themselves, but you have to be very careful, if you're a good journalist, not to use the wrong word in the wrong situation. What does claim? There's in some cases the words has certain what's the right word for it? They have some implication. They imply something that you may not want to imply. What does the word claim suggest? Does it suggest anything different than said? When you say claim. Well, yeah, basically, the question that comes up is, you're kind of suggesting that you might lie. But he claimed it. So you see a lot of Trump quotes using the word claim. Because the writers actually do want to suggest he's lying. And so now in some cases it actually is appropriate if that is the issue. If there really is an issue about whether somebody is lying or at least making stuff up not accurate, then using the word claimed might be appropriate in a story. Because you want to have that connotation with it. That is part of your purpose. But if you're doing it because you're just prejudiced against that source, or if you're not even thinking about the connotation that goes with the word, you don't want to use that word. Because it does suggest there's a reason to question what this person said. That may be accurate. It doesn't have to be necessarily prejudice. It might be appropriate in a science story. If a scientist, I think I may have mentioned the other day that was it this class? Maybe it was the other class. There are scientists now in the area of quantum physics that think we're all part of a computer game, and they're serious about it because things are so exact. They're finding things so exact in quantum physics. They're saying this can't be an accident. This is. So they're saying, if you're going to eliminate God as being the creator, then maybe it's a 14-year-old boy that just created his video game. Something happened here because it's too exact, too perfect. And so there's a team of scientists in Seattle that have gotten millions of dollars to try to catch God in taking a shortcut. In other words, when you do a computer game, all possibilities are not possible. It would take an infinite amount of programming to make all possibilities possible in a computer game. And so they're saying, well, this God figure, whoever it is, whoever made this computer game, if they're not infinite, if their powers are not infinite, they can't make an infinite program. They can't have every possibility open. And so they're looking for whoever created us in this computer game, trying to find their shortcut that they made. What do you do when you run out of programming time? They're serious about it. They're getting $1 million or something to do this. I mean, it sounds bizarre, but quantum physicists, there is not just one. There's a bunch of quantum physicists that think that we're not real. That we just think we're real. Anyway, my point is, you're interviewing some people, and you might want to use the word claimed. Okay, even if they're a scientist, because this is, your readers at least are going to find this questionable, that we're a computer game. So even in a science story, there might be appropriate to use that word, but you do it knowing exactly what you're doing. Are you prejudicing? Are you actually displaying your prejudice, or are you using it in a way to help the reader to understand that in this case of whether we're part of a computer game, that possibly they're wrong. That this is, they claim, but not everybody agrees with this, that we're a part of the computer game. There's still controversy. Therefore, they claim this and somebody else claims that, whatever. So there are times when that verb is appropriate and should actually be used. So that's an example where you might break the rule and where you very purposely don't use said, because you have a situation where people are conflicting with each other, even in a scientific world, and so you want to emphasize that they have a different perspective, and so you use the word claimed. But be very, very careful when you use other verbs other than said. And there are, as I said, editors in America who tell their reporters that's the only verb we're using for attribution. Said. And they point out, and I've had my students try it before, I have them read something from the New York Times or whatever, how many verbs they use. And they didn't notice. They don't know. Because if you only use said, it does not draw attention to itself. Okay. So anyway, excuse me for, I'm taking quite a bit of time because this is important. This is 20% of your grade. And it's more than just your grade. It also is explaining my perspective on news writing, obviously. And I have more experience in news writing than anybody else on campus. So that doesn't mean I'm the best at it, even though I may think I am, but I do have more experience at it. And I come from the country where news writing was fine-tuned in a climate of great, market, kind of evolved in a free marketplace. Okay, interview and responses. I added this one for this class. I wanted to emphasize this, but it's true. I'll keep it there for my other classes. Quality of sources. Did you interview good sources? Were your sources appropriate for the questions you wanted to ask? An expert, for example, can provide credible data, information, background. The expert is usually better prepared and more credible when asked to speculate when absolute knowledge is not available. On the other hand, a victim or a witness can tell you exactly what they saw, what they experienced, what they thought or felt. So there's a time for an expert and there's a time for a real person. And you need to understand the difference. And so with you, I will be judging you by your sources. If you want to, discuss, I'll go back to the grading system. Not only will you get me in trouble, but besides that, you can't really do that just with students. First off, some of them don't know that the administration is telling us what we have to do, so they're not going to be able to give you a valid answer, but they also don't understand why they're doing it. And so you have an incomplete story if you can't answer why. Why are they doing this? Are they just being mean to everybody or whatever? You know, just if you do a story on that subject, you have to get an expert involved. Somebody actually knows what they're talking about, and students in that case don't. That doesn't mean they're excluded from the story, but they can't be the only sources and have a balanced, fair story. Quality information, so not, certainly the quotes are part of it, the interviews are part of it, but other quality information. One of the things that when you go into an interview, there are some interviews I've gone into and had, I've broken stories by going into an interview with no idea what I was going to talk about other than, like in that very first, my first newspaper that I worked at in Tampa, I would take people like judges or city councilmen or the mayor out to lunch, and I would buy lunch for them, and we'd spend like 2 hours sitting there having lunch and talking. I'd turn on a tape recorder, and I'd start off, asking him about his background, where he grew up, stuff like that, real simple questions, get him talking. And pretty soon I'd have a scoop, because I'd find out, this city councilman is thinking about quitting, or he's having to decide either city councilman there, and in many cities is a half-time job. And so I said, I either have to move up or I need to move out. I'm an architect. In the case of this person I'm thinking of, he's an architect. So either I need to become a full-time politician, or it's time for me to quit politics and be an architect and have more time for my family. Okay, so having a very casual conversation without any plan of asking that question came up with a front page story that nobody else had. So there are times when you could do that, and it's quite effective. But typically your interviews are shorter, and you need to know what to ask, and that may be based on doing some homework, Googling them, going through old news stories, the clip file they call it, that stories in the newspaper or in the TV station where you're working, go through other stories that have been written about them, find out what has come up before, and so you kind of pick it up where they left off, so to speak. If there's something controversial, find out about the controversy, as many sides of it as you can, and so you can go in and ask the right questions. Again, this is quality information included and emphasized. That's not just the interviews, but it's also the other background information and so forth. And within the story itself, I mentioned you don't just start stacking up your quotes. Your quotes need to be interweaved in an intelligent way with paraphrases and so forth. And you don't just start with the first quote you have. It may be the last quote you have. And what I can detect is whether some people, including myself, I've been tempted to write a story based on something extraordinary that the person said, something that really catch people's attention. And then I realized I failed to ask any more follow-up questions on that subject. I can't write a story if all I have is one quote and I didn't follow up with other questions. One of your jobs as a journalist is to be smart enough in your interview to follow up when you see, bam, that's an interesting subject I wasn't planning on. I didn't plan on this question, but they just told me something, such as the example I just gave. I need to move up or out. Well, in that case, I did follow up. And so that was what the story is. I asked more questions. I did not anticipate that. He had never suggested that to anybody. And so I had to ad-lib my questions to pursue something that would be, I could tell right then, this is my lead. This is what I'm going to lead my story with. I need more in this, and so I asked some more questions. There's been other times when I failed to do that, and beginning reporters very frequently, they come up, they have one really good quote, they try to use that as their lead, and it doesn't lead. A lead has to lead. A lead has to lead you into the story. And if you use a quote or summarize a quote and you didn't ask any follow-up questions on that subject, you can't use it because it doesn't lead anyplace. You didn't do a good job of interviewing. And so, how you handle your questions reflects on, first off, your ability to organize it, find the most interesting stuff to emphasize, but also reflects on what questions you asked. Did you ask good questions? Did you follow up on this subject? You have this good subject, and did you ask more information? Ask for more information, or did you screw it up like I have done occasionally? Not very often, but occasionally. Okay, we are running out of time. But anyway, again, there's questions of plagiarism, obviously. Did you include all the 5 W's? E here is no first-person comments or second-person references. In American TV, a lot of TV broadcasters put their own opinion and thoughts at the end of their story. And it makes me sick. Print journalists think that's really amateurish. If I want to have a conclusion, and you've all been taught to have a good conclusion. In journalists, as print journalists, we don't necessarily have conclusions in our stories because inverted pyramid just ends. In fact, one of the advantages of inverted pyramid for an editor is that if he runs out of room, he just cuts. Wherever he ran out of room, he cuts. Because by definition, if the reporters are doing their job, the most important stuff is above that point. Wherever you run out of room, there it goes. You're done. Now, they might spend a minute or so making sure that the reporter actually did write an inverted pyramid. But if they did, and most stories should be an inverted pyramid, that's what it allows the editor to do, is not think about conclusions, because inverted pyramid doesn't have conclusions. And wherever you cut, there it goes. You're done. Well, you just run out of material and stop. However, I understand that is going to be hard for you to do, and so I have a suggestion, and that is save at least an indirect quote for the end, so it's somebody else saying something smart. Somebody else giving a conclusion to your story, not you, somebody else. And so you use your source as a person to give you a conclusion, not you. Okay? So it can be an indirect quote or a direct quote, either one, but you save, it can't be your most important quote because it might get cut. If it's your most important one, it should be at the top, but you can save an indirect quote or a direct quote towards the end. Even like a crime story, the police chief says, we're still investigating. Whatever. That's your conclusion. He says something and you're done. You have that sense of a conclusion that all your teachers have taught you. You need to have a conclusion. Well, that's not journalism, but you can do it. So it doesn't drive you crazy. Find a direct quote or an indirect quote to put at the end so you feel like you have a conclusion and it doesn't keep you up at nights. And then in this class, I will want you to, and I will count it to have photographs and or graphics to go with it. So they said this is going to be handed in to the newspaper. They need graphics to go with the story. So I will count that as part of your, I changed the name of it, but basically content. I think I called it before just content. So under content, I said maybe I'll put this under formatting. I don't know. But anyway, photos and graphics will be part of that grade. Also under E, I should also say, if you don't know this already, you should know this, but a journalist writing about a news story, and journalistic writing, not opinion writing, but journalistic writing does not use first person and does not use second person. There's some situations where you might use second person is you, first person is I, me, we. You avoid that. You're trying to use third person, which is they, if you're using a pronoun, or obviously people's names, he, she, they, third person. You're trying to sound objective, and so you very rarely use I, we. That's more of an opinion piece. You avoid it. There are a few, very, very few exceptions to that rule, but I would say for my class, to be on the safe side, don't use I, we, or you outside of a direct quote. If it's a direct quote, then you can obviously as part of the quote. But outside of a direct quote, we don't use them. We use third person. He, she, or rather, they, he, she, so forth. Under formatting, 10%, all paragraphs should be short. This says 1 to 3 sentences. So that's one of the reasons for that. First off, it's more skimmable if your paragraphs are short. But even 3 sentences, when you put it, newspaper is typically 2 inches wide. I don't know how many, what that is. But, I think, what is it, 2.5? You guys worry about that. But anyway, something like that. Your columns in a newspaper are basically about that wide. 3 paragraphs look long when they're only that wide. I mean, three sentences look wide. They look long. And if the paragraph looks long, it looks foreboding, and it's hard for people. It causes some people to just stop reading. If it looks complicated, that looks kind of boring, complicated, they stop. Because that's the way newspaper readers are. They're very fickle. So they can stop at any place and for any reason. Long paragraphs is one of them. You give them short paragraphs. So a 1 sentence, in fact, there is a newspaper editor that makes every sentence its own paragraph in America. Now that goes too far, I think. I think it's a little ridiculous, but my rule is 1 to 3. If it's more than 3, it has to be an exceptional situation, like a staccato sort of thing, where the sentences are like 3 words long. I mean, they have to be really, really, really short sentences, and that hardly ever happens. So 3 sentences as long as you get, typically inverted pyramid style for our class. And then this was an example I gave for a different class, and so it's not exactly what I'm looking at for what you're doing, but nonetheless, it will give you an idea of how to flow. Even this one might be even more as far as how to flow from one person to another person, how to flow your story. This one has like 5 people in it, 5 sources. So that will help you to understand. You can read this. I'm not going to read it now because we're out of time. But I also put another one online. This one here, gangs threaten areas way of life. This is I think just 2 sources, might be 3, but this is one way to write it. This way, in this one, I used the first source as humanizing the story. So it's her story of her daughter being killed by a gang. Okay, so this draws your attention into the story, and then I interview a police officer to give some statistics and so forth. That's one way to use 2 sources. This is usually not the best way, because it's not usually that easy just to say, okay, I'm going to go from one source to another source. That's usually not the best practice. This one, it works because the first source is telling a story. The second source is giving the statistics. I'm going to create another one for you that shows 2 sources that are intermingled throughout the story. That's more likely to be what you're going to do. But this one is on Moodle, and so it's one way to do it, but it's probably not the way you're going to do it. So I'm going to come up with another example for you. Okay?
Is it on Moodle?
What now?
Is it on Moodle?
Yeah, it's on Moodle. At least I think it is. I hope it is. I intended for it to be. If it's not, I will put it there. Okay, any questions? So that kind of goes through. This is the critique sheet. As I said, it's quite thorough. You should understand this critique sheet. Why? Because I made it. And because I'm going to grade according to it, and it reveals how I think as a journalist. It tells you how I edit as an editor, and I'm going to be looking at your stories like an editor. So if you want to outpsych me, you better read this critique sheet very carefully. Okay. And look at the examples. Look how try to understand a little better by looking at some of the examples, how I interweave the quotes and the direct quotes and the indirect quotes. And that's where, like that other one I mentioned, that's actually embedded in with the critique sheet, is that one may actually even do a better job of showing how I intermingle, because like I said, there's 5 sources or something. So I had to go back and forth and weave it through the story in that way. So that one's a little, so yours is going to be somewhere in between. You only got 2 sources probably. If you had more, yeah, you might pick up a little extra credit if you had more sources, but I'm not expecting it from you. 2 is adequate. But probably, and it's possible that this model could be appropriate for you, but probably not. So I had this one, something I could put up really quickly, and I kind of ran out of time preparing for the class. So I'll make you another one, as I said, that's somewhere in between this one and the one actually in the critique sheet. So if you kind of read them both, you kind of get the idea. This is interweaving people. The other one is just one source to another source, because they played a different role. The one giving a personal story, and the other one giving statistics and a police perspective on the story. So it's different. That is appropriate for that story, but not for all multi-source stories. Most of them are not. You don't just go from one source to another source in most stories. So anyway, okay. If not, then we're done. But I will stay around in case somebody has a secret question they don't want everybody else to hear, like me when I was over listening to the other reporters and stealing their quotes and waiting for them to leave so I could ask my questions. But again, I encourage you to ask questions in class, speak loud, and let everybody listen. And because if you have a question, other people have that same question. I guarantee it. You are not so unique as to be the only one with a certain question. So if you have a question, please ask the question. But I will stay till everybody is done asking me questions. Okay? Okay. Well, I guess one other thing I should say about this assignment, in case some of you are anxious to get going on it, I don't want 2 people with the same subject. And so I will have you give me your subject. And once you give me a subject, somebody else can't take the same subject. So I'll have another sheet for you to sign in on. But it's, last semester I taught here, a year ago, I had a lot of people. I had I had a class of 95 people in the editing class, which is ridiculous, but 95 people. And so some story subjects were written on like 6 times or something. And I was going to try to make a newspaper at that time. And one thing, we had too much redundancy. So I want the stories to be unique. I mean, they could be somewhat related if you have a unique angle, but I need a unique angle. I don't want the same story twice, basically. Okay, so I will create a new form for that, and whoever obviously puts their subject at the top as first, everybody else should be looking at the form and saying, oops, I can't do that story. Somebody else has it already. Okay. Okay, thank you.